In October 1962, the world stood on the brink of nuclear disaster. American intelligence discovered Soviet R-12 and R-14 missiles with nuclear warheads deployed in Cuba, just 90 miles from the Florida coast. This discovery triggered immediate alarm in the White House. President John F. Kennedy convened an emergency meeting of the National Security Council (EXCOM) to assess the threat and develop a plan of action. Every minute counted. Soviet ships carrying missiles were heading to Cuba, and any confrontation could trigger a full-scale nuclear exchange between the superpowers. American U-2 reconnaissance aircraft conducted regular flights over the island, recording the installation of missile silos and fortifications. On October 14, 1962, one U-2 was shot down, marking the most dangerous moment of the crisis. The U.S. military insisted on an immediate airstrike and invasion of Cuba. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara and generals advocated for the complete destruction of missile positions. However, Kennedy understood that any sudden move could escalate into global war. Intense diplomatic negotiations with Moscow began. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev proposed a compromise: remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for a public pledge by the U.S. not to invade the island, along with the secret removal of American missiles from Turkey. These measures eased tensions, but the world remained on the edge of catastrophe. The early days of October revealed how close humanity had come to nuclear war and how thin the line was between survival and annihilation. After intelligence confirmed the presence of Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, on October 22, 1962, President Kennedy announced a naval quarantine of the island, officially called a naval isolation. In practice, the blockade meant stopping any Soviet ships heading to Cuba and inspecting their cargo. U.S. Navy ships lined up, creating a potential flashpoint with the Soviet fleet. Every day of the blockade was filled with tension. American aircraft carriers and destroyers shadowed Soviet transports, ready to open fire at the slightest violation. On both sides, invasion and airstrike scenarios were discussed while peace negotiations continued in parallel. On land, U.S. forces prepared for a potential landing on Cuba, including armored units and aircraft deployed on Florida bases. Meanwhile, diplomatic channels were active. U.S. and Soviet ambassadors exchanged messages, Khrushchev made public statements through Soviet media, and Kennedy addressed the nation via television. The blockade acted not only as a physical barrier but also as psychological pressure on Moscow. Each day of delaying Soviet ships increased the likelihood that the leaders of both nations would reconsider their decisions. Tensions peaked on October 24 to 25 when several Soviet ships approached the blockade line. American vessels were ready to use force, but Kennedy's team received new instructions: avoid escalation, demonstrate resolve, but avoid direct conflict. During this period, the world was on the brink of nuclear war for the first time in history. Any wrong move could have been the last. While the blockade increased military pressure on the Soviet Union, diplomatic channels remained active. In October 1962, secret messages between Kennedy and Khrushchev circulated through embassies and trusted intermediaries. These letters contained conditions under which both sides could exit the crisis without direct conflict. The United States demanded the immediate removal of Soviet missiles from Cuba, threatening invasion and escalation. The USSR insisted on guarantees that the U.S. would not interfere in Cuban affairs and assurances for Soviet security. Every word in the correspondence was carefully weighed. A misinterpreted tone could have been considered an act of war. Simultaneously, on-site negotiations continued. In New York and Moscow, closed meetings involved experts on international security. A key part of the U.S. strategy was the demonstrative military presence in the Caribbean. Navy ships and air defense aircraft maintained constant pressure, showing that America was ready to act. Yet diplomatically, both sides sought ways to avoid catastrophe. Kennedy signaled that back-channel discussions could include unofficial concessions, such as a secret promise to remove American missiles from Turkey in exchange for the withdrawal of Soviet missiles from Cuba. This exchange remained unknown to the majority of naval and army commanders, highlighting the complexity of coordinating military force with diplomacy. Every decision at this stage carried critical weight. The blockade could provoke confrontation, and any sudden action at the naval line could result in a strike on an opponent's ship. At the same time, Diplomatic communication occurred under total secrecy, with no room for error. This delicate balance on the edge of war and peace became the key factor in preventing direct conflict. By mid-October 1962, the situation in the Caribbean had reached extreme tension. U.S. destroyers and cruisers formed a line, controlling access to Cuba. Soviet submarines, equipped with torpedoes and ballistic missiles, moved toward the blockade, remaining hidden and extremely dangerous. The most critical moment occurred on October 27, when the American destroyer USS Beale attempted to intercept Soviet submarine B-59. The submarine's commander considered launching a nuclear torpedo because communication with Moscow was limited, and any misstep could be interpreted as aggression. Only the decisiveness of the submarine's officer, who insisted on checking radio contact, prevented catastrophe. At the same time, American aircraft continued reconnaissance flights, tracking Soviet ships and missile installations on Cuba. Each approach of an aircraft to the Soviet fleet could provoke a response, yet intelligence was vital for decision-making in Washington. Critical moments also involved civilian vessels inadvertently entering the blockade zone. Several ships crossed the line, forcing U.S. military personnel to make instant decisions to prevent a collision. Any mistake could have been interpreted as the start of war. Historians emphasize that these days, October 24th to 28th, represented the peak of the crisis. Despite the pressure and fear, both sides avoided irreversible actions. The balance between demonstrating power and willingness to negotiate became the decisive factor that kept the world on the brink of disaster without actual combat. After the most tense days in October, both sides understood that an open conflict could lead to disaster. In Washington, President Kennedy and his advisors analyzed all possible courses of action: ground invasion, blockade, airstrikes. Simultaneously, in Moscow, Khrushchev discussed countermeasures and ways to preserve the Soviet Union's image. The key element was a secret letter sent from Khrushchev to Kennedy on October 26. In it, the Soviet leader promised to remove the missiles from Cuba on the condition that the U.S. guarantee non-interference in the island's internal affairs and publicly commit not to invade. The American side received this message through a personal intermediary, special diplomatic channels bypassing normal communication to avoid leaks and escalation. The correspondence was not limited to letters. Telegraph lines and encrypted messages allowed for clarifications of terms. The critical points were the timing of the missile withdrawal and confirmation that U.S. forces would not occupy Cuba. Every word mattered. Even minor misinterpretations could be seen as a concession or provocation. In Washington, public and private actions were carefully coordinated. Publicly, the blockade was announced to demonstrate power and control, while behind-the-scenes diplomacy proceeded. On October 27, Kennedy sent a response letter, partially accepting Khrushchev's conditions, without publicly disclosing the removal of missiles in Turkey, allowing both sides to save face. These secret steps proved decisive. No major combat occurred because diplomatic communication continued alongside military readiness. No one knew exactly when or where the crisis might escalate into open war, but the exchange of letters provided a temporary de-escalation and a chance to avoid catastrophe. From October 28 to the end of the month, the situation in Cuba remained tense but controlled. American ships participating in the naval blockade held their positions in the Caribbean Sea, preventing Soviet vessels from approaching the island. Each ship was equipped with communication systems, and officers maintained strict distances to avoid accidental clashes. On land and in the air, preparations were made for any scenario. American F-100 fighters and B-52 bombers patrolled the skies, while Soviet R-12 and R-14 missiles on Cuba remained on high alert. Neither side took reckless actions. The focus was on monitoring and control to ensure the crisis ended safely. In Washington, Kennedy and his advisors monitored every Soviet move, using intelligence, radio intercepts, and high-altitude reconnaissance photographs. Secret U-2 flights allowed precise identification of missile locations and numbers, while tracking Soviet troop movements helped predict potential provocations. Soviet officers on Cuba followed directives but understood the situation was critical. Khrushchev and the Soviet leadership issued clear instructions: no aggression without direct orders from Moscow. This limited initiative on the ground and prevented the risk of accidental escalation. Gradually, both sides began coordinating actions through secret channels. The U.S. confirmed no invasion would occur, while the Soviet Union prepared ships and missiles for withdrawal. On October 28 to 29, Soviet ships began turning back, and equipment gradually left Cuba. The process was monitored by both American observers and Soviet officers to ensure full compliance with the agreements. The crisis demonstrated how fragile international stability was. Any misstep, even accidental, could have triggered disaster. Secret communication channels, constant surveillance, and disciplined execution on the ground were decisive elements that allowed the world to avoid nuclear war. After the Soviet missiles were withdrawn from Cuba, the world gained a brief but tense reprieve. Within the U.S. administration, discussions began on the future strategy toward the Soviet Union. Kennedy and his advisors realized that diplomacy and secret negotiations had been more effective than overt threats of force. In the USSR, the crisis was also analyzed. Khrushchev understood that a direct confrontation with a nuclear power could have catastrophic consequences. Upon returning to Moscow, a decision was made to strengthen communication channels with Washington and to avoid abrupt international actions without prior consultation. The Cuban Missile Crisis influenced the entire international security system. In December 1962, a direct communication line between the Kremlin and the White House was established, known as the Hotline. Its purpose was to enable instant information exchange, preventing misunderstandings and accidental escalation. The political lessons of the crisis were reflected in subsequent arms control treaties. Bilateral negotiations led to the signing of the Limited Test Ban Treaty in 1963, prohibiting nuclear tests in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater. Both sides realized that crises of this magnitude should not recur, and the need for precise coordination became evident. For the leaders themselves, the personal experience became a valuable lesson. Kennedy and Khrushchev later remarked that the fear of immediate catastrophe changed their approach to crisis management. Decisions had to be taken jointly, informed by intelligence, diplomacy, and analysis of likely consequences. Culturally and psychologically, the crisis left a mark on both societies. The American public became aware of the risk of nuclear war and the value of intelligence, diplomacy, and allies. In the USSR, the lessons manifested in caution in foreign policy decisions and stricter discipline among the military. The Cuban Missile Crisis was not only a peak moment of Cold War tension but also a test of deterrence mechanisms. Its consequences shaped superpower relations for years, laying the groundwork for strategic arms agreements and ongoing dialogue between the leaders of the two powers. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 became a turning point that reshaped the strategic mindset of the U.S. armed forces. The military was compelled to reassess its response plans to a potential nuclear confrontation and to refine command structures and communication systems. Experience demonstrated that speed of decision-making and accuracy of information were critical in preventing catastrophe. For the U.S. Air Force, the crisis spurred the development of early warning systems. Patrol aircraft and satellite surveillance enhanced monitoring of potential Soviet weapon placements. The establishment of the North American Aerospace Defense Command (NORAD) gained renewed momentum, and coordination with other agencies, including the State Department and CIA, became standard practice. In the Navy, interaction with the Air Force and Army within the framework of Joint Command was strengthened. Strategic bomber squadrons and submarine forces received new directives on mobility and stealth to ensure the ability to launch a retaliatory strike while minimizing the risk of sudden attack. Special attention was given to training crews for rapid response to threat alerts, including operations under nighttime and adverse weather conditions. The crisis also catalyzed the development of new nuclear weapons protocols. For the first time, formal rules were established for the storage, transportation, and management of warheads, including clear delineation of authority between the President, the Department of Defense, and military commanders. These measures reduced the likelihood of accidental or unauthorized use of nuclear weapons. Within the Army and Marine Corps, officer training for crisis planning was intensified. Escalation scenarios were created, and practices for command coordination and information sharing under limited communication conditions were refined. This experience prepared the U.S. Armed Forces for more flexible, rapid, and precise responses to threats worldwide. American society and political leadership also recognized the need for constant oversight of Allied forces and potential adversaries. The introduction of regular exercises, communication system tests, and intelligence sharing became routine, strengthening the country's strategic resilience. The Cuban Missile Crisis left a lasting imprint on the formation of the U.S. strategic culture. It demonstrated that technical superiority and operational readiness, supported by reliable communication channels and strict protocols, could prevent a global catastrophe and maintain national security at the highest level. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 demonstrated to the world how close humanity had come to nuclear catastrophe. The consequences for international politics were immediate and profound. After the incident, both superpowers, the US and the USSR, began revising their deterrence strategies and diplomatic approaches to conflict. President John F. Kennedy and his advisors used the lessons of the crisis to strengthen direct communication with Soviet leadership. The hotline was established, a direct link between Washington and Moscow, allowing instant information exchange during future crises and preventing misunderstandings that could escalate into war. Within the United Nations, the crisis stimulated more active involvement of international mediators and strengthened collective security mechanisms. It became clear that bilateral agreements between superpowers were insufficient and that international pressure could play a decisive role in preventing nuclear conflict. The crisis also accelerated arms control agreements. By 1963, the Partial Test Ban Treaty (PTBT) was signed, prohibiting nuclear tests in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater. This step was a direct consequence of lessons learned during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the risk of accidental nuclear use became evident. The impact on U.S. allies and NATO was significant. European countries recognized the need for coordination with American command and the integration of their early warning and missile defense systems. The crisis encouraged closer military technical integration among allies and the development of joint strategic exercises. The Soviet Union also drew lessons. The crisis revealed the limits of strategic mobility and concealment, as well as the vulnerability of infrastructure reliant on diplomatic and military channels. In the following years, the USSR increased attention to early warning systems, mobile delivery means, and the strengthening of control over allies in Eastern Europe. For the global public, the Cuban Missile Crisis was a powerful lesson in the fragility of the balance of power and the necessity of diplomacy, even amid strategic competition. The lessons of the crisis laid the foundation for diplomatic, military, and technical reforms that continued shaping global security for decades. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 left an indelible mark on the strategic culture of the United States and the world. The experience of the week when humanity teetered on the brink of nuclear catastrophe became the foundation for reforms in diplomacy, the armed forces, and command systems. In the United States, the crisis accelerated the creation of more coordinated early warning systems and modernization of strategic command. New procedures were introduced for verifying information and decision-making at the highest levels. The lessons of the crisis became a mandatory part of the training for senior command staff in the Army, Navy, and Air Force. From the perspective of international diplomacy, the crisis demonstrated the effectiveness of direct communication channels and personal negotiations between leaders. The lessons learned in October 1962 inspired the creation of multilateral mechanisms for de-escalation. Joint exercises, intelligence sharing, and regular consultations between nuclear powers. The crisis also elevated the role of scientific and technical experts in government structures. Analyzing missile deployment data, verifying potential attack information, and simulating nuclear conflict scenarios became routine. Scientists in the National Security Agency, Department of Defense, and Intelligence played a key role in decision-making, minimizing the risk of human error. For the global public, the Cuban Missile Crisis became a symbol of the dangers of the strategic arms race and the need for nuclear arsenal control. Public support for disarmament treaties and superpower cooperation increased, leading in subsequent years to several nuclear arms reduction agreements. Long-term consequences were also felt in the Soviet Union. Recognition of the vulnerability and limitations of strategic mobility and communications led to modernization of command structures and tighter control over allied nations. As a result, in the later years of the Cold War, both superpowers had systems to prevent accidental escalation, although tensions persisted. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a lesson in the value of diplomacy, information exchange, and preparedness. It showed that weapon technologies are important, but their management and the ability to communicate can be decisive. These lessons became the foundation of conflict prevention policies and strategic deterrence, maintaining stability amid global competition for decades.